First of all, I'd like to thank Ambassador Rooney for pushing, promoting, being inspired, or arranging this event, helping arrange it. I think it's very interesting that I think one of the first things you did, or one of the first projects you were looking at in your office was looking at this and promoting it and helping Dwight to make it happen. So I want to commend you for that vision, and I want to commend everyone here for coming along. I hope it's a productive and useful day. I hope we get into real detail, or you get the chance into detail that is useful for you. Can I set a context as much as anything else on it? I don't know, pull me up if I start to get bad on timing, but I think what I can do is maybe just set a very broad context from an Irish perspective, and from a green perspective. I noticed the ambassador's in his green tie, his wife is in a very nice green shawl. I wish I'd worn my green tie this morning and I thought about it, but I come from a green political background, part of the coalition government here between Fianna Fáil and the Green Party. And I came into office 3 years ago as Minister, having covered the area in opposition, which is a useful introduction for me. And I would have come in, I suppose, particularly from our own political perspective, very much charged on the importance of us making change in energy, because we're very much seized with what I see is a geological reality we face, a peak in global oil production, which is going to require us, a country which is very heavily dependent on imported oil, to start making a switch away from it. It's interesting to see in the last 3 or 4 years that perception has become far more commonly held. I was at a recent ministerial meeting of the International Energy Agency, and if you look at what it is saying, that the era of cheap oil is over, that what is our current course is patently unsustainable, that the time for government is time for governments to act, and they have to act now. That's an International Energy Agency that had been very cautious and very kind of a contrary view to this peak oil view only 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago. And now a very strong message coming from the International Energy Agency saying actually governments do have to react and act. And I was very much taken by the US Department of Energy report they commissioned, I think, from Bob Hirsch about 5 years ago, saying you have to act almost 2 decades in advance to have an effect in this energy area, because the fleet of cars we buy today will still be on the road in 15 years' time. The fleet of airplanes we have will equally be in existence in 20 years' time. So I was just very charged with a sense of urgency for a country like Ireland, which is very dependent on imported fossil fuels, to prepare for that future when fossil fuels are going to be more expensive. They'll still be available, but my sense is just much more expensive, and therefore it was important for us to wean ourselves off that dependency. The interesting thing for me is, if you look at what sort of percentage reduction I see as we have to make, or we should make prudently, it very much matches the sort of speed of change we need to make in terms of meeting our climate change targets. That we need to be looking at what is roughly 3% per annum reduction in CO2 emissions, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and that will also protect us from the fossil fuel future that I see ahead of us. So the two issues go inextricably together. Obviously we've had a difficult year in terms of the climate change negotiations. The outcome of Copenhagen was, from a European perspective, disappointing. But recognising that there has been a lot of good work done. There's individual elements within the overall package which actually were quite progressive. What we need now is, I suppose, to continue not to lose our momentum, but to put some of those packages into action and actually agree a broader agreement over the next whatever period of time we're going to do it. But that's just a background from my political perspective. Those two issues, both climate change and the resource limits that we see in the energy area, drive how we actually drive me in terms of every day waking up. I have a sense of urgency. I'm going to try and get this country away from dependency on those fossil fuels and cut our emissions. One other thought, and just the great thing about the job I'm at the moment, is you need some very good people One person that just impressed me, and he gave a very simple message that I thought about and agreed with, was John Ashton. He was the UK climate change advisor to the outgoing UK government. He made a very simple point that if you have that sense of urgency, and if you see the need for this change away from such fossil fuels dependency, we are going to require a form of globalisation. That the technology transfer that we need will not work on a localised basis. If we all just retreat into our own individual markets, we will not meet the targets to prevent runaway climate change. That we will have to have a particular technology transfer between the main manufacturing, design, development economies in the US, in Europe and in China. And I think it's an important first-base principle in terms of, okay, are we agreed here that this is going to be a free trade or an open trade solution? And for me the answer is yes. It has to be fair, and it has to be, we have to get our currencies and other things right. But I don't believe that we're going to solve it in going away from a globalised solution if it actually requires us to get a globalised trading solution. And if you get those three blocks in particular, you have most of the world economy covered, most of the new developing products coming out of those three economies. So that's just for me a principle in terms of what we're, how we, or where we fit in this global solution. It has to be global, it has to be traded, and it has to be green, in my mind. Can I just give a perspective of what's happening at the EU Council of Ministers? And I think EU is getting a fair old battering at the moment, the Eurozone is risky and so on, but we shouldn't underestimate the success of the European Union project. And I would say if you look at the whole climate change agenda, and indeed the energy portfolio in general, it's an area or a clear example of how the European Union project works. The 2020 climate change targets, 20% reduction in emissions, 20% renewables within our energy mix, and 20% improvement in efficiency by 2020 sounds incredibly kind of trite, easy. You know, someone that was dreamt up in the marketing department somewhere in the bowels of the European Commission. But actually, when you actually look into what it looks or demands on each country, and you look at the mechanism and the structure that was put behind it, it is probably about the right package to get us on a path towards a more sustainable, low-carbon economy. It's quite challenging, actually, in each of the areas for most countries. And it's a hell of a political achievement. I'm sure you'll be watching over in Congress and the Senate trying to get your climate change carbon package through in the next few months. It's not easy to do this. But it was done in the European Council, and it was done because there was real leadership at heads of government level, and also leadership, I believe, at the Energy Ministerial Council, which is an increasingly important role as I see it. I think we still have a bit of work to do to actually pass that knowledge and understanding into some other areas. Our finance ministers or our enterprise ministers maybe don't quite understand, I think, the scale of the ambition that has been committed to. You know, these are mandatory European Union targets. These are not take it or leave it. This is European directive saying you shall have 20% renewables energy, each country varies slightly in its percentage, but you shall be part of an absolutely legislatively determined European Union approach to cutting out carbon, developing our own renewable resources and being energy efficient. So I think that political achievement in the Union, regardless of what we've done in Copenhagen subsequently, gives anyone working in the European Union real certainty that we're going in this low carbon direction. And I think it's important just to acknowledge, first of all, that work, but also that it gives real certainty for investors, I believe, in terms of what the political direction is and what the market system is going to be based here. And even post-Copenhagen, and the informal ministers of both the energy ministers and the environment ministers earlier this year, there was a very strong sense that across all countries we're set on our course. And if anything, we need to, with this downturn in the demand destruction that has occurred, maybe look to kind of going further. So it's just an important backdrop to what's happening. Can I say also, I think there's a sense here in the economic strategy, I gave out about the enterprise ministers there, but I think they're starting to see, as the American administration is saying, as the Chinese administration is saying, that actually in a very severe downturn, in a very severe economic recessionary period that we have had, it is a new economy opportunities that actually lift you out of it. The stimulus plan in the US, very much concentrating one of the elements in clean energy, is being matched by some of the investments here in Europe, where what finances and funding have available is increasingly being steered disproportionately and correctly in my mind towards this new clean energy sector as a new economy opportunity that we have to be good at. Europe's probably ahead of those two other major economies, China and US, but it's in danger of falling behind unless it keeps investing, unless it actually keeps its political foot on the pedal in terms of having real expertise and technological advantage in this area. And so I think out of the economic downturn we're in, there's an absolute sense as well as the energy benefit in terms of making this change, that there is an economic benefit that we're not going to avoid or miss. Can I just very briefly then just go from the European stage down to look at our own country and give very broad sweeping assessment, just very broad just sense of some of what's happening. Firstly, a recognition that we are very over-reliant on fossil fuels. 95% only, the exact figures of our energy mix. 92%. It's improved in the last 3 years. 92% imported fossil fuel as part of our energy mix leaves us exposed should there be increasing fossil fuel prices similar to the one that occurred 2 or 3 years ago. And we did have, it was starting to be a drag on our economy in terms of a less competitive economy because of the high gas prices, high oil prices that arose in recent years. We have a slight respite at the present time. That gas, shale gas, hydrofracking of gas technology that seems to be developing in the States, which has brought the States spot market of gas down, I think provides us of a window of opportunity where fossil fuel prices, particularly in gas, are not going to be as high for the next 5-6 years. The International Energy Agency are giving that prediction. If it does, it helps us not just in the use of gas itself, but because gas makes up about 60% of our electricity generation, it gives us just a path where we've got a 5 to 6 year period, lower gas prices, and therefore more competitive electricity prices here. And from my mind, that's just a small window that allows us to actually hedge our position, develop our renewables, make us less reliant on imported fossil fuels. Second thing I think you'd say about the country on a more positive note is I think actually what we have done, maybe is an example, by dint largely of our foreign direct investment strategy, is we have to a certain extent broken the link between economic development and carbon. That the concentration of the likes of biomedical devices, biopharmacy, ICT companies, services, financial services here in recent years has seen, despite the downturn in the last 2 years, has seen an economy that has actually seen very substantial economic growth, not matched by growth in its emissions. Most of our emissions difficulties are in relation to our transport sector and agricultural sector, rather than our industrial economic sector per se. And it is something that we've done and we need to do more of. Once you start doing something, you tend to get good at it. And I think there's some interesting figures around that as to what we have been able to do. Lastly, can I say, just before I go into just some of the detail of what's going on in energy here, I think you'd have to say as well that we have benefited not in being members of the European Union, not just in the broader climate change targets I mentioned earlier on, but we tend to be a country which obeys the rules in the European Union. Sometimes, I was talking to Richard Vernon last night, sometimes hair-pullingly, frustratingly, too much so. You think, God, do we have to go for state aids clearance on that again, or do we have to get compliance to the nth degree? But you're more Nordic, maybe, rather than Southern. We're learning something about ourselves as a country. We always imagined ourselves as being somewhere down south of Portugal. But actually, if you look at what we actually do, we tend to be compliant. And the benefit of that, I think, in the energy area, is that we took those European directives 10 years ago in terms of setting a move towards a regulated energy market, and we implemented them fairly effectively. It took us 10 years to do it, but I'm absolutely convinced from my position that we have a competitive, properly regulated energy market, particularly in the electricity sector. and it's started to bring benefits in terms of low prices, but also just a properly regulated market in which it's easier, should be easier to invest. And I think it's just one of the elements in the mix of what we have in the country that we should acknowledge or recognise. It was those European Union directives setting us in the course of a proper regulated market structure that we've actually done, and I think we've done quite well. In terms of, if I was to summarise then just what we're doing, or what I wake up every morning and say that sense of urgency, in energy it's in two key projects. First and most important is for us to become more efficient in our use of energy. And the second is to develop our renewables, our own indigenous energy sources in the energy mix that we have. It's a fairly simple strategy. It is one that's fairly set here in stone here, I think, for the next number of years, because I don't see divergence in the political spectrum on that basic premise that we're going to be good at efficiency, we're going to be good at renewables. Almost all the political parties, if anything, they're just criticising me, and I would have been criticising the previous minister for not being strong and quick enough. So I don't see here, regardless of the component of government, and actually in energy you have to think long term outside the government cycle, I don't see a change in that political environment for energy policy. I think we all across the political system actually maybe are slightly longer term thinking in some ways than people involved in the market, and from my experience are all committed to this course of energy efficiency and renewables development. Three areas, or I just maybe mention, and I'll finish, a number of areas where we're working. As I said, efficiency comes first, it seems to me. I was very proud when we launched our National Energy Efficiency Action Plan that Avery Lovins from the Rocky Manston Institute came to Dublin and added his voice and his brains and ideas to what we were doing. It is the first thing to do. It's the first most important change. It's too warm in this building this morning. I don't know if anybody else feels that, but for me I think we could turn the dial down about 2 or 3 degrees and still be very comfortable and immediately start saving a few bob. One of the first things we did in government is came in and changed the building regulations to really ramp it up to support more energy efficient buildings. We're following the approach the UK government has taken, I think quite a progressive step-by-step approach aiming towards what we call passive housing, effectively housing that becomes CO2 neutral. And it is the first and most best economic return in the energy area. Those McKinsey cost of living curves, just it stands out as that's obvious economic policy you have to, energy policy you have to adapt. One of the things we're doing is we are supporting or funding that through various support schemes. We're going into about 60,000 houses this year and retrofitting insulation and more energy efficient devices to help those houses improve their performance. And we're going to ramp that up to about 100,000 houses and particularly go into the public buildings area and the commercial buildings. And I think we're fairly flagrantly stealing from the US system where some of the very clever use of energy service companies matched with obligations on energy utilities to try and achieve those objectives rather than having it all grant assisted from the Irish Exchequer. And our scale of ambition is now, I was actually thinking about it, I met Stephen Chu at that International Energy Agency Ministerial, and he was kind of proudly, rightly standing up and saying, you know, the US is looking like putting in a $400 million stimulus plan for retrofitting buildings. And I thought, well, we're doing 100 million this year. And I thought that, we're not a quarter the size of the US, so it kind of gave me a certain encouragement. Yeah, we're doing the right thing and we're pushing it. Can I maybe just concentrate though on the energy efficiency area in buildings, because it seems to me it's where, in my ministry, I cover communications as well as energy. There is this crossover point between the two. And what we're doing in terms of behavioural trials for smart meters, with the aim of putting a smart meter into every house in this country, and what we're doing in deploying electric vehicles here first, as a national grid network, where we've entered now into agreements between international motor companies, between our distribution electricity company, DSB, and between the government, is actually, I think, quite advanced. And it's the opportunity for us to avail of the expertise that exists here in a lot of those ICT companies that have come here. It allows us to avail of the fairly advanced grid we have, which we've invested in recent years because we had to, because the growth of the economy was pushing the edge of the envelope all the time in terms of what our grid could take. And we see this as a way of an opportunity to use it. We have a reasonably good wireless telecommunications system, which we have had to develop because our housing is very dispersed. So if you look at those 3 or 4 factors: good grid, reasonably good communication system now evolving, a national system. We have a national broadband scheme so that no house, or within 2 years, every single house will be able to get broadband. We have a range of technologies, WiMAX, 3G, as well as the fixed wireless technology. So we have a lot of ICT companies here who are interested in this area of energy efficiency. I see that as an opportunity for us to develop the systems here. We won't make electric cars, we probably might even make the batteries, but what we can be good at is making the software, the systems that you actually need to make this new smart grid work. Again, I was taking what Stephen Chu said at that energy ministerial meeting. He said if we could transfer the smart communications technology we have within the car energy system into the home, we would have something like an 80% improvement in energy efficiency. And that's why I put the smart metering and electric vehicles together. They're both, it seems to me, when we're looking at doing it, they're both issues of data management is the crucial issue that has to be refined and progressed. And there will increasingly be, I think, crossover between the car and the home as a combined energy system for the person. And that's a project that we're working on. I think that's of real importance, and I'm sure today there'll be some details on it. I'll be brief now in terms of renewables and the other components, and we're quite happy to take questions afterwards if you want to go into detail on any issue, either here or in a coffee break later. I'd have to hold up our hands up and say we probably haven't done enough or quickly enough in the whole biomass heat area. There's a lot of work to be done there, and there's areas where we need to progress further. I think what we've done in biofuels in the European Union is again progressive in setting an obligation system that can be adjusted over the next 10 years as we take account of what's actually happening with biofuels in terms of land use effects and which technologies in terms of second generation biofuels are developing. And maybe this is an area where you can see really the effect of international, where there has to be international cooperation. The biofuels regime put in by the US government 4 or 5 years ago had a real knock-on effect in terms of European markets and other markets. And I thought we have to be careful how we do this. And I think what the European Union is saying is, yes, we're going to develop biofuels as a secure supply in a world where oil is going to be more uncertain in its delivery. But we have to do it in a way that's sensitive, and we have to be very aware of the environmental effects and social effects before we really ramp it up. So I think we're doing that in a good way, and we have our own legislation in the Dáil at the present time. It's back in the Dáil tomorrow.